Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in both the Russian and the Ukrainian economies, and specifically to talk about the 28-point peace plan that's been put forward by Donald Trump. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that over the past few months, the sanctions against Russia have really been ramped up. We've seen major companies such as Rosneft and Lukoil, the two biggest oil companies in Russia, being hit with direct sanctions. And all of the sanctions are designed to encourage Russia to stop the war in Ukraine. That's the whole point of why these sanction packages have been announced consistently since the invasion of Ukraine took place. And over the past few months, we've really started to see those sanctions biting. So we're seeing a huge reduction in demand for Russian oil. So both China, India, and also Turkey have now pulled back on their purchases of Russian oil as a result of the fact that any company that's proven to be dealing with Russian entities that are sanctioned, including Rosneft and Lukoil, will face secondary sanctions themselves. So basically, you could lose all of your international trade if you're found out to be buying that Russian oil. So that's why companies in all of those countries are pulling back from dealing with Russia. And I recently reported that the price of Russian oil had fallen to $36 per barrel, compared with over $60 for Brent crude. So it's now almost trading at half the level of international oil. So this tells us that the sanctions are working. And we've already talked about the fact that Russia is overspending. It's investing more into its war in Ukraine than ever before, and it's receiving less revenue. So the deficit in Russia is building. And the only way to fund the deficit is either to use your cash reserves, and that's what Russia has been doing. It's been running down its national wealth fund, which was sitting at around about $150 billion at the start of the war in Ukraine. The last reported levels, it was down to around 30 billion. Now, we don't have an update on that as yet. But at the rate of spending that Russia is going, it's going to run out of money at some point in the next 6 to 12 months. But actually, when you look at what's happening with revenue and the oil bans and everything else, Russia is rapidly running out of options. So this represents a really good time to put a peace proposal in front of Russia, because Russia is now desperate for the war to come to a conclusion. President Putin won't want to lose any face. He's a very proud individual, so he won't want to be seen as pulling back because he's running out of cash. But if a deal can be put forward that's mutually beneficial to both Russia and Ukraine, well, when I say mutually beneficial, obviously nothing's going to be really beneficial from Ukraine's point of view. It's sort of lose-lose from their point of view. They're not gaining anything as a result of a peace deal. But what will happen is that the war will come to a conclusion and people will stop dying. And this war's been going on for over 1,330 days now. And we don't have an exact figure as to how many lives have been lost, but it's hundreds of thousands. Probably 100,000 Ukrainians have lost their life. Probably 250,000 Russians have lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands of other people have been wounded, and millions of people have been affected by this war. So there is a good reason to bring it to a conclusion. Obviously, from an economic point of view, it's severely damaged both Ukraine and Russia. They would be doing significantly better if this war hadn't taken place. And I think the global economy would also be better because we wouldn't have all these sanctions in place, and we wouldn't have had all the movements in oil prices and food prices and all the things that have been affected. So I think it's fair to say that most people in the world want this war to stop. And Donald Trump is at the forefront of trying to put together a deal. And his latest proposal is a 28-point plan that he's told Ukraine has to be agreed by next Thursday. So they've only got a few days to make a decision. Now, I thought it was worth running through a few of the details in that plan, because I don't think this is highly attractive from Ukraine's point of view. And I don't think it reflects where Russia is sitting right now in terms of the problems being caused by the increase in the sanctions. So I think the biggest issue that's coming out of this plan is that Ukraine has to cede land. Now, we talked a lot over the last few months, well, ever since Donald Trump came into power, that it's likely that any deal that's agreed is going to have to concede some land to Russia because Russia is not going to pull out of all of the areas that it's occupying. So, unless Ukraine can drive all of the Russian forces back to the Russian borders, we're not going to get any sort of conclusion. But the deal that's been put forward in this 28-point plan asks Ukraine, firstly, to concede Crimea. Now, Crimea was invaded back in 2014, and Russia has been controlling that region ever since. So that's 11 years ago. But Ukraine hasn't officially given up hope of getting that territory back. But as part of this deal, Ukraine would have to agree to sign over Crimea officially to Russia. And in addition to that, it's going to have to concede all 4 regions that Russia is currently occupying, including some land that Russia isn't occupying. So, in the Donetsk region, which Russia claims should be part of Russia, there are areas of that Ukraine are still occupying. But as part of this deal, they would have to basically walk away from those areas and hand all of that land over to Russia. So, I think that's going to be a big sticking point. And it's a similar situation in Luhansk. There's also some land that will need to be given over to Russia that's not currently occupied. So that's basically quite a big ask from Ukraine's point of view, not just to give over where Russia's sitting at the moment, but also to give it additional land and then have new boundaries drawn up, and all of that would then fall under the boundaries of Russia. Now, in terms of how many people we are talking about in the affected regions, it's hard to put an exact figure on it because a lot of people fled the area immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, and obviously lots of people have died. But it's estimated that before the war started, somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million people were living in those regions. Now, that's quite a lot of people. If you think about that in the context of countries, there are countries in the world that have less than 5 million people. There's quite a lot of countries, in fact. So we're talking about giving over a huge amount of land and the control of lots of people who will then officially be under Russian jurisdiction. But it's not just land that's being conceded as part of this 28-point plan. Ukraine will have to officially give up any hope of joining NATO, so NATO membership will be outlawed. It will also not be able to have any NATO troops on Ukrainian land. So originally there was talk about a peacekeeping force being put into Ukraine to stop Russia from advancing any further in the future, but that won't be allowed under the terms of this 28-point deal. The Ukrainian army will also be capped at 600,000 people, so it won't be able to build its forces to defend itself against Russia beyond where it's sitting at the moment. So I think those points are going to be real sticking points from Ukraine's perspective. Now, from Russia's point of view, they're being offered the 4 areas that they've invaded, plus Crimea that they've been occupying since 2014. So that's basically what President Putin is looking for. He wanted to expand the borders of Russia. But in addition to that, there's also a program to lift the sanctions that are in place. So Russia will be allowed back into the international markets gradually. It won't be overnight. So there's no details as to what that looks like, how quickly Russia would be able to start selling its oil and gas again into all of the global markets. But in addition to that, Russia also has the prospect of joining the G8. So the G7 are 7 of the biggest economies in the world. It was previously the G8, but then the G8 was disbanded when Russia originally invaded Crimea. And so Russia would then be allowed back into international decision making and being able to shape the global economy. So I think from Russia's point of view, this does look very attractive. So the key question here is, will Ukraine agree to this? Well, the European countries that have been supporting Ukraine have all come out and said that this plan needs a lot of work. And there are conversations going on at the moment to try to negotiate to get a better deal for Ukraine, something that is going to be more palatable. And I don't think the deadline of Thursday is realistic. Donald Trump has said that. But realistically, this deal is not going to be agreed within the matter of 3 or 4 days. There's just too much at stake. The war's been going on for far too long for that to be done. But we've got a deal put forward, which I guess is a positive. It's just it doesn't look very attractive from Ukraine's point of view at this point in time. So, what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking a lot about the really damaging impact of the sanctions on the Russian economy, particularly over the past few months. And it's very likely that Russia is heading for a deep recession. We don't have the quarterly figures yet, but when the quarterly figures come out for the final quarter of 2025 and the first quarter of 2026, I think we will be seeing Russia showing a contraction in GDP, and 2 quarters of continuous contraction represents a recession. And that's where Russia is heading because it doesn't really have many options left. If China and India and Turkey stop buying Russian oil, Russia is bust because Russian oil is basically the lifeblood of the economy. That's what pays for everything. Russia is basically an exporter of oil and gas, not so much gas these days because its biggest buyers, Europe, have turned their back on Russia. But it's still selling lots of oil, billions of dollars worth every single year. So that's what's funding the economy and particularly the war in Ukraine. So the fact that the sanctions are really tightening at the moment means that Russia is running out of cash. It's still spending heavily on the war and everything else. And so at some point, it's going to run out of money. So this represents a really good time to get a deal agreed between Russia and Ukraine because Russia is now at a weak point. And this situation has been recognized by Donald Trump, who's now put forward this 28-point plan. But as we've talked about in today's video, the 28-point plan looks more beneficial to Russia than it does to Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine isn't going to come out of this with any wins because it's all negative in terms of all the areas that it's currently seeing occupied by Russia. Its economy has been devastated. Lots of people have died and been injured, and we've got long-standing issues for the Ukrainian people. So there's no real upside for Ukraine. But I guess bringing the war to an end is probably as good as it's going to get from Ukraine's point of view. But what Ukraine wants is guarantees that this is never going to happen again. Because in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, Ukraine obviously wasn't very happy about that. And then we had the same situation in 2022 when Russia decided to invade again. So the last thing that Ukraine wants is the ability for Russia at some point down the line to decide that it wants more of the territory. So in the previous discussions with the European Union, there was talk of a peacekeeping force being put into place in Ukraine. So that would be a NATO-backed organization that basically would stop Russia or deter Russia from invading the region, because you would then have NATO troops on the ground. And if Russia invaded, then potentially that could draw NATO into the conflict. But as part of this deal that's been put forward, not only does Ukraine have to concede all of the occupied territory, plus some unoccupied territory that forms those regions, which I think is a big ask in itself to give over land that isn't even occupied right now. But in addition to that, Ukraine is going to have to say that it will never join NATO, which is something that it's been desperate to do over the past few years. And in fact, before the war in Ukraine, that was one of the reasons why Russia invaded, because it wanted to do so before Ukraine became a member of NATO, and therefore Russia would technically be invading a NATO country. So it's going to have to say it will never join NATO, but also the NATO forces that were previously going to be a peacekeeping force to stop Russia advancing further will not be allowed either. So I don't think this gives a lot of security to Ukraine. And when you think about what's happened in the past, Russia has obviously invaded Ukraine twice over the last 11 years. So it does have a track record of doing so. So would it break a promise not to do it again? Well, the history tells us that it possibly might do. So I think from Ukraine's point of view, this deal looks quite unattractive. I don't really see that it's got enough guarantees or support from NATO to be able to give Ukraine that comfort factor that this is not going to be a problem further down the road. So I'd be very surprised if the European countries and Ukraine agree to this deal. Donald Trump has given a deadline of 3 or 4 days for everybody to agree to this. I don't think realistically that's going to happen. I think that will be waived or ignored. Everyone will just look past that. But we are seeing a deal being put together. I think it'll be interesting to see what the response is from Ukraine and the European Union, because this is the time to agree a deal. Russia is now weak. It's going to have to do something to bring this war to an end. Otherwise, the Russian economy is going to genuinely collapse, it doesn't have enough money to keep funding the war, if that's seen as a priority, which it has been, then other areas of the economy are going to suffer because funds will be diverted away from things like education and health and infrastructure into the war in Ukraine. And that means that Russia is going to start seeing everything decaying. It's going to start seeing even further losses. And that's just not sustainable. And I think President Putin, even though he's laser focused on what's happening in Ukraine, will have to acknowledge at some point that he needs to keep the economy balanced. So I think a deal will be agreed at some point in the not too distant future. But I don't think the 28-point plan that's been put forward is the deal that will be signed by Ukraine and supported by the European Union, because I think it's just too favourable for Russia and too negative from Ukraine's point of view. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee, really appreciate that. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks, I really appreciate that too. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you so much for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated and thinking up new ideas for videos. So thanks so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.